Hello and welcome to the Space in Between podcast. I'm your host, Leigh Morgan. This podcast is for listeners who are fed up with the hyper-polarized nature of the world today and who crave spaces where current events can be discussed in constructive, enlightening, and delightful ways. Let's get started. Hello, friend. Thanks for joining the Space in Between today. We are going to have a conversation that sits smack dab at the intersection of something many of us feel, but don't always have the words for. And that is this dominant Western societal assumption about achievement, which is often linked to success or what progress looks like. Many of us have been told that more is better, that growth is always good, and that if the economic numbers are up, things must be working. And yet, increasingly, folks are questioning these narratives. I know I am. That's happening in part because while the stock market has had a great year, more people are food insecure. We also know that many people feel more anxious, more divided, more isolated from each other than ever before. And that's true even when basic needs are met. On this episode, we're going to slow things down and sit in this tension. We're not going to point fingers. We're not going to condemn entire economic systems. Rather, we will ask a more human question. What happens when an old economic story stops serving our well-being? And what might want to take its place? I'm really glad to explore this with my brilliant and kind guest, Gaya Herrington. Gaya is an economist who has spent years studying the reality and consequences of economic growth and what it might mean to design economies that actually center human and planetary well-being. I'm going to put a link to her fantastic TED talk on this topic, and she brings a lot of clarity and humility to conversations that are too often oversimplified and politicized. So, Gaya, I'm so excited you're here. Welcome to the Space in Between.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Leigh.
Well, listen, I'm going to start where I start with all my guests and just ask, when you think about growth and economics and this notion of well-being, you really light up in person and then in your many forums and TED Talks. Where does that passion come from?
I can put this in a way, a pessimistic way or optimistic way. The negative way is it comes from my privilege, and the optimistic way is it comes from this need, this not a physical but a more spiritual, emotional need that I think all human beings have. Almost all of us are innately. We're born with this desire to leave the world a little bit better than we found it, to feel that we are connected, that there's a higher purpose, that our daily tasks are contributing to that. And you can't get to there when your basic needs like food, shelter, security are not met. So that's why I do recognize this comes from a place of privilege, but I also think that we are all born with this. And one of the many ways that poverty robs us of our dignity is also that it's not just the basic needs, it's not just our bodily health, it's also our mental health, where we're deprived of being able to look and contribute to something bigger than ourselves.
You are so clear-headed about this notion of service and helping the world, and you just articulated that. Is this a value that came from your family or your upbringing? I'm just curious, where does that wellspring come from?
Probably, yes. Again, I do think that we are born with it, but of course it also has to be nurtured. And I was born, I'm a dual citizen, I'm a naturalized American. But I was born in the Netherlands, so to middle class parents who were also hippies in the 60s, so it's probably there. Also, I had this very egalitarian upbringing where they were like, we were all made the joint decisions, the children with the parents sitting at the dinner table, like, what are we going to do now? So I guess that is all in it. But at the same time, I really do think that we all have this. If you look at findings of anthropologists, or if you go back in time, most of the time, actually, humans have organized together in communities and larger societies on very egalitarian principles.
Mm.
So you talked about this old story of growth. In the longer perspective, it's actually very recent. So for most of human history, growth was considered, or the pursuit of everlasting growth, I should say. It's not anti-growth, but this pursuit of growth at all other costs, if necessary, is extremely recent. We have all grown up with it. That's true, but it's really on the large scale of since the Homo genus has been in existence, it's an absolute blip.
Okay, that's a great tee up to actually ask you to set the table, if you will, about your research and your findings about economic growth. Because most of us, like me, we aren't economic experts. We don't have that historical perspective, which you were just referencing.
Oh,
Uh,
we're not taught that in economics classes, are we?
exactly. And when I say our culture, we're here living in the US, we're doing this podcast. It's also true there are many subcultures all around the world. And as you and I have talked about, many indigenous cultures actually do not start from a mindset that growth is always good. But we're really talking to folks today, the US or in Western culture. So tell us a little bit about economic growth and what a different approach of centering on well-being could look and feel like.
Yes. Yeah, so I also very much started from within the dominant paradigm. So let's be clear that you mentioned I studied econometrics. So, for example, what we call economics classes today, I was taught those. They're really only one school of economics. They don't tell you that. They said this is the only form of economics. This is not true. It's one class. It's called neoclassical economics. And in that, there are underlying stories, for example. We all know this because most of us, even if you do psychology or whatever, you have this 101, economics 101 mandatory class. And they teach you that a good economic model to represent humans is the Homo economicus, right? We are aware of that person, the calculating man, selfish, maximizing, never satisfied. So that doesn't describe us very well, but that's where all the models are based on. So that's the dominant paradigm from that economics school. And I was very much trained in that. After that, I went to work in the financial sector for many years. I have worked at the Dutch Central Bank. I was the national representative in the Basel Commission for Banking Supervision. So I very much come from there. And so I also used to think that growth is always good. It's a proxy, it's an imperfect indicator of progress. And I've come to realize that this is just inherently flawed, and more people are coming to that conclusion. So when I came to the US, I went back to school to study to get another master's in sustainability. And for that, I wrote my thesis on the limits to growth,
Okay.
which I should introduce, unfortunately, even though it was a bestseller at the time. It was 1972. It was a bestseller. It was discussed at the federal level. Uh, this was done by a group of MIT scientists. We created a
Okay,
first
I
of its
missed
kind.
that bestseller, although I was young, very, very young, 70s, I would say.
One of the authors, Dennis Meadows, he's still alive, and he once said, when the book just came out, people came up to me after he's done thousands of events and interviews, and he said afterwards people would come up to me and say, "Your book changed my life," and he said, and then a decade later, people come up to me and they said, "Your book changed my parents' life." And he said, and now these days people are like, "Oh, you wrote a book?" So it's been very effectively
Wow.
buried. And I will tell you why I think that was the case. But it was initially a bestseller, and it just said it used a new modeling technique from MIT called system dynamics. They used that to create its first of its kind world model. And in neoclassical economics, most variables are very static. They don't move a whole lot. Most of them are exogenous, meaning you have no influence on them in the formula. And in system dynamics, all variables interact. So it allows you to model complex systems, such as I think our society or the economy.
Okay.
And so they let it run with global population, global industrial output, a whole bunch of variables. And then they concluded that if the business as usual scenario, which ran on historical averages only, so no additional assumptions, you would see a peak in welfare and industrial output setting in around now, reaching about now, and then a steep decline setting in, and they call that collapse.
Can I check one thing? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm really
And
curious. Is is what you're saying that we're kind of at the peak of this? There was some prediction in the early 70s that there would be a decline coming, and we're now in the
at the
middle of
peak,
that or the beginning of
this is
it?
it.
Okay.
That is what I'm saying. Yes, that is what that trajectory, that is what that scenario said. So I should point out that collapse doesn't mean the end of civilization.
Okay, that's an
Does
important point.
yes, because collapse sometimes people it's a dramatic term for
Yes, it is.
people. But it is a steep decline from a previous peak. That's just the
Okay.
technology, and it's still very much undesirable. I also think that it's unavoidable at this point, and I don't like saying that, but what I did, my research was I took several of those scenarios, including the business as usual scenario. There were more scenarios, of course, with additional assumptions, and I plotted empirical data to those global variables to see which ones were most closely aligned with where we are, and the business as usual was most closely aligned. So
Mm.
that was the conclusion of the book. It was called The Limits to Growth. And he said there growth will halt one way or another because we live on an abundant yet finite planet. And so the choice is not whether we can keep growing forever or not. We can't. The question is, will the end of growth come by design or by disaster? So business as usual would be disaster. Design was also in there. There were scenarios there where we had additional assumptions on human behavior. Notably, they set a cap to how much industrial output they were going to take on, and all those resources that were freed up from that cap, they were redirected to natural protection and human services like healthcare and education. And in that, the declines were avoided, but we're not most closely aligned with that scenario.
So just to repeat, as a global community, which is anticipating some scarcity of resources, and that we might start thinking about distributing resources or taking action to mitigate things like climate change or the hoarding of wealth by fewer and fewer people, which is one of our realities now. We're living in a time where income inequality has never been higher. Fewer people have more money than ever before. Am I sniffing down the right track here?
Spot on. Thank you for that segue.
I'll be your
I,
PR person.
because this is yes, let's do that. So this is precisely what I wanted to come back to of why I think limits to growth is buried. You mentioned resource scarcity. Yes, I want to point out that that was actually what how it was discredited at the time. They said, "Oh,
Oh,
resource scarcity, really?" And then we got technologies that made certain resources more available, and they said, and
okay.
that was actually used to discredit it. And what is often missed about the limits to growth is the S, the plural, limits to growth. Yes, of course, we can innovate ourselves out of one constraint. Humans are very innovative. But what happens typically in a closed, complex system, the unintended consequences, what are called externalities in neoclassical economics, which could not be a thing in a closed system, but those typically the externalities or consequences of the efforts of trying to innovate out of one constraint lead to a new constraint. If you read those books, actually, then they said, listen, it's not that collapse will come from completely having no resources left or being 100% polluted in the waters. What happens is that these new limits from the efforts of getting out of another limit will come over time. That's what the model shows us. They come faster and faster. And the effort to get out of the new constraint will become more and more costly. And ultimately, what we will run out of is our ability to cope. And that's what this crisis is, this sense of, oh my God, nothing makes sense. Like, I don't even, what is happening right now? The stark contradictions of so much suffering and at the same time, so much opulence. This polycrisis is humanity running out of its ability to cope.
Okay, I'm going to say what you just said, which I think it's really profound, that this polycrisis we find ourselves in it's accelerating, it's very complicated, and the poly part, the multiple crises that we're experiencing, I think for me and for my friend who's listening right now, we all would say, holy crap.
Yes, we are all saying that. We're
You
all saying that. Yeah.
wake up every day and there's some new thing
What?
of some
Yes.
new thing and what and I think that's accurate regardless of where one might identify on the political spectrum or the many different identities that we have. So you're just describing an acceleration of the polycrises and over time, less and less capacity as societies and in our economies and probably in communities to cope well, because again, it's faster.
Right. I've started to work more with collapsologists who just study how collapse happens and stuff recently for obvious reasons.
Collapsologists. That is a new word. Wow.
Yes.
Collapsology.
For obvious reasons. And also, that's also this describing what you're describing, this sense is very common in collapse, where you're up the peak and then this little thing just before, because you're going down, but not that far yet, right? It's about to accelerate, but you're not here yet. And this is a very common sense of like, we're clearly losing control. I mean, it's all here yet. I want to very briefly touch on what you said about the inequality, because that is a very important aspect here. And I think this logical sequence is very important to follow, which is when you talk about limits, you're talking about ecological limits, planetary boundaries, right? The planet is finite, you're talking about nature. And ultimately, it's in the environmental realm. And so initially, that's why it was a bestseller. And people in high places were also interested. They're like, well, we don't want ecosystem collapse. Nobody wants that. But then they realized a few months later, I think, that, oh, but wait a minute. If our abundant planet is in the end finite, that means if we want to eradicate poverty, if we want to have a livelihoods guaranteed for every single one on the planet, then we have to divide what we already have more equally.
Okay.
And that, I think, goes to the heart of wealth inequality. It's totally possible to meet everybody's needs on this planet,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it would have to be, we would have to see a massive redistribution of resources. And I think that's why it was so
Got it.
attacked so viciously at the time.
Yeah. Got it. That's a really helpful framing and context. Okay, so well-being economy, which you are so passionate about. And for me, in our conversations, it puts me in a place of hopefulness amidst this sense of what the hell, of,
Yeah, I know.
this collapse. Tell us a little bit about what the well-being economy is and why it's important and relevant for all of us.
So a well-being economy is where the ultimate goal of the economy is human and ecological well-being. So meeting human needs, physical and emotional and spiritual, and well, with it staying within planetary boundaries, and ideally regenerating the ecosystem around you. So it's not this, basically, that's what it comes down to, but what it is, business, government, nonprofits, and citizens in their daily tasks, they all work towards this goal of improving human and ecological well-being. And they can still have growth. Businesses can still be profitable, but the ultimate goal is different. So, for example, what that means is that a business is profit making instead of profit maximizing, which is a key difference. So, if it contributes to well-being, they can make a profit of it, but if it doesn't, they won't do it. And the same with a government. The government is, of course, also very much locked into GDP growth right now. And the argument is we can't pay for our social services without GDP growth, which is true. All of our systems are designed around growth right now. But that is ultimately a design choice. That was a design choice. Right now, everything is built around it. So our infrastructure, up to almost our physical infrastructure, is now there. And that's also why I think at this point, collapse is no longer avoidable. But the systems are crumbling. And so we need a new vision for how we're going to do it better after collapse. Because again, it's not the end of civilization.
Yeah, thank you.
And that's what this well-being economy is, a way to design better after collapse.
So, and just to clarify, GDP is gross domestic product, which is a metric commonly used to assess whether a nation state, most often, although you can measure the GDP for the European Union or regions as well. It's a metric that has to do with the purchase and sale of goods and how robust that is. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So it's really, so it measures quantity, not quality. So if we have a lot of floods or fires, like in California, after that we have to rebuild. So it's good for GDP in that sense, because the more products are sold, but it's obviously not good for well-being. So it measures quantity, not quality. There are many things that are wrong about it. It measures throughput, but not how much wealth you accumulate. So if you think that our natural resources are also national wealth, which I think it is, clean air, clean waters, all those things, then it doesn't take that into account. It's a meme cliche of, yeah, a standing forest is worth nothing, and having it cut down is measured in GDP. And that goes for a lot of stuff. Our health, for example, healthy people, they don't contribute to GDP at all. If you're sick, you're much more valuable to the gross domestic product. So it just goes to show that it's a bad measure. And I'm not the only one who's saying that. Many people have said that, including the one who came up with it. Kuznets is the one who came
What?
up with it. Yes, and he said, okay, so this is useful maybe now, because that was after the Second World War. And he said, for rebuild, this might be a good proxy, not for welfare, to be clear, but we could use that for now, maybe to see how we're doing in the
Uh,
rebuild. He said it's not a good measure for well-being, and we just ran with it anyway.
So here we are, and even in my introductory remarks, talked about the stories we grew up with of GDP is kind of the measure of a country or society's success. So the more money that's produced, the more jobs that can be measured. And what I also want to say that is so core to a podcast is what we're not saying is that GDP as a measure of economic activity in and of itself is bad. What I'm hearing you say is it's a metric that has become a dominant metric about what's good or bad and what we should aspire to. And it is inherently limited because it was never meant to be a measure or a proxy of things like your words, physical, emotional, or spiritual health. And
Right.
at the end
Exactly.
of our lives, we're sitting there thinking, how was my life? We're probably not saying, I wish I made more money or sold more things. We're probably going to, in fact, we actually know this from
We know
people.
this. Yeah.
It's been studied and researched. It's connections, it's well being, it's our sense of spirituality, whatever shape that takes to a person. It's how did we live our lives? And yet GDP is the dominant thing that we say, well, they're a poor country and so they're bad. And you and I know we spent time with indigenous peoples in their territories. And I'll say the vast diversity of indigenous peoples, vast
Hmm.
diversity of views and worldviews, et cetera. Even within that, there are experiences we've had where it's just not a starting point of how much money you could make.
Very lucky in that
Yeah.
sense. I feel here in the Cascadia Bay region, which is where
Hmm.
Seattle is, and Vancouver, and Oregon, and parts of Northern California. We are very lucky that we can still pull from that wisdom, because obviously when I said, well, we've been doing this for a long time, right? Today, these notions of the regenerative or indeed indigenous economy is best preserved in those communities, and we're very lucky. I was born in the Netherlands, so in some ways we're definitely further along in circularity. For example, Amsterdam is doing a lot in it. And at the same time, I'm like, yeah, the narrative of humans not as the apex predator, but humans as a very special, unique accelerator and servant of life, that's best preserved in indigenous communities.
So, what would you say to critics who would say, oh, this is all touchy feely stuff and unrealistic because we're a global community, we rely on trade and massive scales, and if we were just to turn that off, and go to this well-being economy. There's people listening.
So trade is something different. We've had trade long before this growth imperative. But no, thank you for that question, because you're right. That is what you often hear, this ridiculous notion that, oh, so we're going to go back to living in caves. No, literally nobody's saying that. Okay, it's just such a straw man argument. Of course, in the well-being economy, we're going to have a lot of technology. We're going to have better use of it. You're probably aware that right now AI is being used to create thousands of deepfake pornography of women and children every day. I don't think that's the best use, okay? In general, this whole video slop is very energy intense. We all know this. Um, I think we could have much better use just deploying it only for optimizing energy flows from renewable sources with more
Right.
stable ones. That's also an application. That's a good application. We should keep that. The other part is actually way more wasteful, and it has negative societal value. The thing is, it's technology is a tool. So it will be used for the overall goal of the economy. Right now, it's mostly used for growth. But in a well-being economy, it would be deployed towards, again, well-being.
So the key here is to optimize profit in ways that improves our well-beings, emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being. That's the key here. And we do
Hmm.
see some examples of many companies
Oh,
who
yeah.
who are, who are really trying to say our goods and services are here and designed to be additive to society in a way. So that's not a new concept. There are lots of companies out there. There's some big ones, there's some small ones. Is it accurate that your invitation for us is to be much more intentional everywhere in our business models, but also in our policy frameworks, where we might offer incentives for more companies to develop goods, services, products that are explicitly enabling well-being? And you might say then so much of the health sector, right? And I'm a part of that. People sign up every day to go to work for organizations that are helping people. So how do you make sense of that?
Yes, you should do that, but it starts at a very deeply personal level. It's a good segue. I think we need to talk, because I hear this a lot. People are like, okay, so those are some massive global systemic issues you're talking about, because it's a very difficult message of being part of a system. The old domination paradigm talks about control, right? We can control this planet. We can innovate it with new technologies. The bees are dying. We can invent robot pollinators. That's not dystopian at all. This other narrative, it needs to start within yourself first, because we've all grown up in this harmful dominant narrative of that we're selfish and we're bad people, we can't be trusted, so the best thing we can hope for is the market or technology to save us. And it's not who we are. So you have to first start with this new narrative that I think describes us much better, in which we are nature. And yes, we can be selfish if our basic needs are not met, but once they are, we're very playful and curious, and we have a strong desire to contribute to this web of life that we all feel part of. So you heal from that old narrative, and then you see how you can build out that new narrative in your everyday decision. You do have to be aware there's a lot of greenwashing going on. So you can't say, like, oh yeah, only buy from green companies. And they're like, I'm a green company. A good way to tell is typically if they're employee owned. I'm not saying there's never been any bad employee owned companies, but typically those are a lot better. They're community rooted, etc. They're profit making, not profit maximizing. You have several of those. About 20% of companies in the US are profit making, not profit maximizing. Cooperative banks, credit unions, same thing.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I want to say is those are still things at the consumer level. So I do want to add a level to that, because we're mostly treated these days as consumers, which is very dispiriting, because you're
Mm.
treated only for how much money you have. So another thing is that we become citizens again. So you connect with your local community where you live, maybe also if you're in a multinational or a company, people around you, and talk about this new narrative and see how you could implement that where you are and where you work.
And this notion of narrative is important because it gets to the stories and mental models that we all have. that help us make sense of the world. And we're kind of deconstructing in this conversation long held assumptions about gross domestic product as a dominant, the most important proxy for a country or society's well being, right? And we even talk about, that wealth, where there's more money, that's a proxy for well-being. And you're saying no, it actually was never meant to be that way. It's not the way it is, but there are ways to begin moving, giving your business to cooperatively owned places and being attentive in our own minds, noticing where we're not contributing to the well-being economy ourselves.
Yeah, that's correct. And one notion, for example, is this concept of enough that I talk about in my TED Talk, right? And I think that also has this personal aspect. If you talk about consumerism, there's a clear distinction between needs and wants, actually. But in a growthist economy, this is very purposefully blurred. Why? Because one clear difference between needs and wants is needs can be satisfied. That is not useful for a growthist economy, right? It's very good news if you want to stay within planetary boundaries because you don't need an endless amount of resources to have everybody's needs met. But if the goal is growth, oh yeah, that okay. So now we have to fabricate all the time, and that's mainly what's now happening in marketing, right? Is this ad telling me I'm good enough? Because that's the story of the new narrative. That's a part of it. Like enough for everybody, so no one below the social foundation, but also at some point it's enough. And we don't have to ask more. I think that is key in this current economy, in an economy where you can never have enough. It's easy to feel like you never are enough, right? And I think that's a very, very widely carried sense. So one of the small ways you can do it every day is like, is this signaling to me that I'm not good enough? Because in that case, I probably don't really need it because it's a fabricated want and not a real need.
I want to ask you a personal question about moments in your life where you realized you were either out of alignment with that, or you had a sense of like, wow, this is a dominant narrative that I have about myself. Was there some moments that stand out for you personally?
It is really a journey because we all of us have grown up in this paradigm that maybe in the grand scheme of things, yeah, in historical perspective is new, but we have grown up in it. So we are always surrounded in it. So we have internalized it. So it's an ongoing journey. I think you have to realize that. I think I'm becoming better at it because I'm seeing it every day where this is a domination mindset narrative. So the short answer to your question is like, no, there's not a concrete thing that made me go, aha. It's really been much more of a more of a yoga process, if that makes sense, or a
Uh-huh.
massage progress, where I went into like the small little blockades in my mental map and I pressed on it and then I let it go. And over time, it released the tension and the blockade there. And I was like, oh, huh, yeah, I don't really need that. I think that is one of the key insights where another key difference between needs and wants, for example, is when needs are unsatisfied, the result is suffering. But
Yeah.
you don't have to
Yeah.
go that far for it to be a real impact. Wants are very different. It is almost, I think it's therapeutic to just sit there and reflect on a want, that one time where you thought you really wanted that thing and it was going to make a difference in your life. And then you didn't get it and you cried over it and you were so angry. And then you look back and you're like, huh, I don't think it would have made any difference today. That's very common for wants. So I think that's the way to put it. But I was speaking at the European Economic Forum in last November, and before me there was a man on the stage, and he was in a suit, relatively heavy built, relatively older white man, and he was just sitting there and he said, "We have to get back to business because Europe doesn't dominate in the world anymore." And I thought that was such a
Wow.
perfect picture of the domination mindset and the neo-colonialism, I would say, that some people still bring in Europe or the US.
I'm sure you were a refreshing counterbalance to that on the stage. And this notion of needs and wants, again, where basic needs are not met that is suffering. And we actually had, I know this from the Gates Foundation, up to the 2020s, a pretty remarkable reduction in extreme poverty, or this amazingly successful global vaccine alliance push to get kids basic vaccinations, which has saved tens of millions of lives. So that's an example where basic needs were met in a new way, and so we had less infant mortality, et cetera. So that's a good thing. We want needs met, but where you get through that door, then it's tricky, because then all of a sudden we
The
get
law
these
of
messages.
diminishing returns.
Yes,
Um,
because
no, please.
then we have the narratives about growth, of have more, have a bigger house, or have a better car, or get paid more money, and
So
that becomes
that's so there's you are just a phenomenal person in setting me up right for all the key points I want to make. So
good.
first of all, the Gates Foundation focuses on exclusively on I think on in the global south, so they don't work in Europe or anything. So what you typically do see in poorer countries is that yes, there's a stronger correlation between income, whether it's per capita or at the national level, so GDP. There is more of a correlation at the when you're at low material levels. The correlation between income and yes, well-being for the reasons that you just described, is quite strong. It's not always there still, but it is certainly true. We're not arguing that that we shouldn't have growth in the global south. Of course not, because
Yes.
again, human suffering. The pathway towards a well-being economy for will look very different for different countries and even communities. So in the US, where we have enough stuff to satisfy our needs, we have intolerable, as far as I'm concerned, inexcusable, immoral inequality in the US. So there is still a lot of poverty,
I
but
agree.
we are, as on a national level, affluent. So for us, the trick is it's not to grow, but to distribute what we have more equally and guarantee safeguard livelihoods in that collapse. So
Y-
degrowth in that sense these days is very similar to collapse resilience. It didn't used to be that because degrowth is also still hoping we could avoid a collapse. But now that I think it's unavoidable, degrowth and other what collapsologists call collapse resilience is basically the same. And so again, what the Gates Foundation would focus on, we wouldn't be against that kind of growth because,
Yes,
like you said,
thank you.
having people having their needs met, of course not. It's just that it's very interesting because one of the things that techno optimists argue for is, oh no, we see decoupling, uh, and it's like, okay, listen. First of all, you're talking about carbon decoupling. This is a very important aspect of sustainability because it goes to climate change, but it's far from the only challenge we're facing.
I'm just struck by, you just gave an example of kind of in a climate space. There's a lot of nuance to this discussion, isn't there? Right. And so again, that's what the space in between, that's why we're here. There's not a black and white view. And you just gave us a really helpful example of, well, wait a minute. In low wealth settings where there tends to be more literal scarcity of food, shelter, access to healthcare, you can have a really big positive impact on health and well-being, where you can introduce per capita income that can go up because there's more resources, and you might actually have money as a government to build a more robust healthcare system. And yet you're saying in higher wealth settings, we have a different set of dynamics where I
Yeah.
think many of us seduced to saying, well, because over there, when per capita income goes up, that's holds true for us also. And yet, I'll give an example that I've shared on the podcast before. The Edelman Trust Barometer comes out every year. It's a big PR firm, and they measure levels of trust in societies. And levels of trust in societies is actually directly correlated with sense of health and well-being. Okay. And so we're seeing dramatic reduction in levels of trust in high wealth countries. That's where it's declining the most. There's trust is declining faster and in the most in high wealth settings.
You're right. We could certainly talk about the carbon decoupling. So also, I want to go to where you see in the West, and what you mentioned earlier, is a almost complete decoupling of happiness or well-being from GDP growth. So GDP growth has been steadily increasing. And since the 70s, if you look at a broader measure of it, such as by Herman Daly, a senior World Bank economist who was at the University of Maryland, he constructed an addition to the GDP. So not just throughput, but also the things that you mentioned. And the GPI, the genuine progress indicator, that has been steadily decreasing since the 70s. So we see a proper decoupling of happiness from not of environmental impact, but from GDP. And this is what you mentioned. So at the beginning, you have a strong correlation, and then you have these diminishing returns, which is
Okay.
very normal. Again, economic laws are not different from human laws, and because it is a human construct, we know that sometimes growth is good and sometimes it's bad. This is not a hard concept. Diminishing returns, like the first cake is great and then the second not so great anymore. This all makes total sense, but for some reason we act like this is not the case in economics, even though it's there. So Easterling was one of the first economists who pointed it out. He said, so you have a very tight correlation, and then you have this inflection point, and then it almost flattens. Now, that inflection point, I think, is where we move from satisfying needs with our stuff to wants. That's why it's
Right.
happening.
That's why it's happening. So that's helpful. And I love this notion of a genuine progress indicator. I'm going to get the link and we'll put that in the show notes. We're going to begin wrapping up. And I want to ask you something pretty provocative. So we live in unsettled times. We talked about that. There's lots of polarization. There's a caustic tone and tenor to our politics, not just in the US, but world order is being upset as we talk about it, of in the United States threatening its allies. Things that are literally unheard of, flying
Unheard
in
of.
and
Yep.
snatching presidents, even as horrible as they are, like that. That's an
Yep.
upset of
The US
established norms.
government meddling in Latin American governing, that's
A lot.
unfortunately very heard of,
And
unfortunately.
we can talk for an hour about all the stuff that's happening. The meta theme is there's a lot of polarization, there's a lot of fracture. And you have offered a critique and criticism of growth at all costs. You've offered this compelling vision for a well-being economy and given us a number of examples of where that can be manifest. As you think about your work, because you have people in front of you on the stage saying, why aren't we growing more? You're out there rallying, saying we can do this, people. What advice would you give to listeners? Let's say you have the Gaia magic wand, right? What would be your one wish for listeners that you'd leave them with to say, we can do this, you can do this, you, me, anyone listening to this podcast? What's the one wish you would give?
Hmm. God, I'm torn between two answers.
You can give two. You can have
I'm
two
just gonna be
wishes.
sneaky and give both of them. Yeah, I'm just gonna be greedy. So the first one would be the inner one, and I would wish for everybody to feel that they are enough. I think it really comes from embracing that enoughness. A lot of the stuff that we see, like the violence and just the meanness of people, also comes from this notion that ultimately you're not worthy as you are of love. And I think the second one is to say, from that place, please connect with people. The vast majority of people, a small percentage of the population is born a sociopath. They genuinely don't care about impacts to others. Most of us do. If you look at surveys, most people agree with post-growth policies. They subscribe to these underlying values of, oh yeah, we're in it together, etc. So, yet it's not happening. And that's because we're not connected enough. So, like I said, connecting your communities, one great things that US has over Europe. Europe is absolutely ahead in many ways when it comes to this post-growth thinking. But one real leg up that the US has is that we still have this indigenous wisdom, and we have very active what is called bioregionalism movements, which encompass everything we just discussed. So if you're like, okay, connect, how? Look up your bioregion, and that because they're all over the US.
I love it. Each of us can be thoughtful and reflective around what does enough mean to us at a really deeply personal level. And there's a spiritual teacher, a guy by the name of Michael Beckwith, that I've become aware of, and he often talks about literally just saying 3 times a day, I have enough. Now, you're going to say it if that's accurate and true for you and your family, right? So if that's true, oh, what an amazing thing to actually have enough. And just to repeat that over and over again, because the stories we tell ourselves, that we speak to ourselves and others, that actually influences how we think and how we feel.
You don't
And
just have enough, you are enough.
that's right. I am enough at a personal level. And then it is also a nice contradiction to also say, and I have enough if it's true, because then it provides
Mhm.
a
Mhm.
stark relief to the wants, which
Mhm.
you've spoken so eloquently about. And then I love again the other wish, which is connection with others. Fundamentally, we are kind, generous people. I really believe, despite the noise, despite the caustic rhetoric, despite the scapegoating and stereotyping, that there's way more kindness, there's way more love, there's way more generosity in the world. And making time to notice that by connecting with others, I think, is a powerful, powerful anecdote, my friend. So I am grateful for you spending time today in the space in between. I appreciate your work in the world and highlighting there's another way of being, which is about well-being and human connection that really matters. So thank you for dropping some serious wisdom here today.
It was such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Leigh.
It was a lot of fun. I can't wait to see you again. Thanks for being on the space in between. Bye for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Space in Between podcast. If you did, please hit the like button and leave a review wherever you listen to the show. And check out the spaceinbetween.com website, where you can also leave me a message. Take good care.